Hello, welcome to Local Chats. I'm Lewis Adams. Today on the show, our guest is Tom O'Callaghan. Hey, how you doing?
Hey, how you going?
Now, Tom and I normally do a podcast together, Bendigo Decides, which is also available. There'll be a link to it just down below, but it's probably on the website that you're on. At the moment, we are talking about state politics and that sort of stuff, because it is an election year. But today, I'm talking with Tom about something a bit different. And you recently went to Nepal, didn't you?
Yeah, a couple of years ago. But I'm writing about it at the moment, writing about some of the things I saw on my trip. A little bit of a travel blog, but not so much what I did on my trip, just some of the things that some of the themes and other things that I saw, and trying to just explore that a little bit. You know, Nepal's such a mysterious place, such a strange and interesting place. There's so many different things that happen there, and a lot of them, to Western eyes, and that includes mine, don't really make sense. And so I guess what I'm trying to do with a lot of the blog posts that I'm doing at the moment on my Tom Wright Stuff blog post is try to make sense of some of the things I've seen.
That is, of course, tomwrightstuff.wordpress.com, and you've put up one post so far.
Yeah, it's pretty slow going at the moment because I've got to write it, and I'm trying to do a lot of research as well to try and get a lot of my stuff as accurate as I possibly can, but also make it a really interesting read. So the first one I've done is called Tigers in the Doorway, which is about my visit to the Narayanhat, I hope I'm going to say this right, the Narayanhat Hiti Palace. I'm sorry to everybody in Nepal who are laughing at me for my bad pronunciation, but you'll have to forgive me because I'm not very good at pronunciation.
On your blog, you describe the post: 2 tigers, elephants in arms, murder in the billiard room, and the death of a king.
Well, I started it, I want to kind of give it that kind of feel of giving it a description and maybe having the story there, but not really telling you very much about the story. You can draw your own conclusions and maybe read through and see what I've written after that. I'd be really interested to see other people who have been to the kind of places that I went, what they kind of think of my descriptions and what their thoughts are too. So maybe it's just a way of trying to get people interested in having the conversation as well.
You start off with tigers.
2 tigers. Yeah.
Tell us about your post. Tell us the story behind your post.
I was in Kathmandu, and it was getting towards the end of my trip, and I thought, there's this place that I keep walking past, because I love walking around Kathmandu, and there was this place I kept walking past, this museum, which was called, here we go again, the Narayanhat Hiti Palace. It was a working palace for years. I don't think it is anymore, or maybe there's people who go in there every so often to use it, but it's been turned largely into a museum. And I went in there, and I very quickly realised that this was the epicenter of one of the most vicious murders that I know of that's happened in Nepal, and one of the most mysterious and astounding ones, in which the Crown Prince in the royal family, Dipendra, went out and murdered as many people as he could in his family. He walked into the billiard room and opened fire and killed a lot of them. And I think that that was really the end of the monarchy, effectively, in Nepal. And the monarchy kind of went along for a couple of years, but it never really quite came back from this awful murder that happened. And of course now Nepal's a republic. But I guess the reason why I called it 2 tigers is because there's these tigers, stuffed tigers, in the museum. As there's quite a lot of stuffed animals, because subcontinental royalty are a lot like European royalty. They like to just kill animals and stuff them and stick them in their rooms. And I think there's something about, the tiger, that animal that hunts things, that's always in the shadows but jumps out very quickly, that I think reminded me a lot of Crown Prince Dipendra.
Now, this is one of those events, the assassination of royalty in Nepal, that it's a very huge event in the recent history of that nation. But we're a couple of Westerners in our media. I don't remember it happening. If it was in the news, it would have been buried in page 47.
I think at the time, because this happened in about 2000, and at the time, the world's media was just completely puzzled. There was just, I very vaguely remember seeing stories when I was young, and they were of these people who just these journalists all rocked up to Kathmandu, as they do when there's these kind of events.
Yeah.
They rock up to wherever something's happening, and they just couldn't make sense of it. They just couldn't understand what was going on. I don't think anybody ever really has, because even the Nepalese people, I think it's quite an uncomfortable event in their history, and partly it's because they just don't understand it. There's a lot of conspiracy theories that it was another member of the family or another kind of sub-part of the family that was behind it, and you look at it and try and unpack the events and you think, well, maybe it was. It just doesn't make much sense.
There's too much that would have gone on behind closed doors, and really the rest of the world are just outsiders.
Yeah, and the Nepalese royal family is fairly closed off, always has been.
Yep.
Very closed off from the public. Quite an interesting family, because in the 1950s they actually took back power in a coup against a rival family, and there's a history between those particular families that goes back to some massacres back in the 18th and 19th century too. So there's always been this kind of bloodthirstiness, but this was, I guess, something that came out of nowhere, that was, if Crown Prince Dipendra did do it, an act of a madman, and a madman probably high on drugs at the time.
Now, you say that you have chosen the image of the tigers, and it sounds to me like you're drawing a comparison between the tigers and the people that used to live in Nepal themselves.
There's a really interesting history in the subcontinent of hunting animals.
Yeah.
Partly because all royalty likes to shoot things, particularly, you see the invention of guns came with all kinds of royalty all over the world, just kind of lolloping along shooting stuff. But it really became something quite incredible, quite a spectacle in places like India and Nepal. You had these massive game hunting sessions that were taking place in the 19th and 20th century. You'd have royalty, the Ranas the local lords in places like India going out on these massive trains of elephants, and the same in Nepal as well. You have elephant after elephant going out, and you'd have all these people who were trained specialists who, were really probably just really poor people who needed some money, and they would go out into the forest and beat down the undergrowth and push animals out into clearings, and they would be huge things. The Queen of England actually went, they were hoping to go on one of the hunts that happened in the 1960s. I don't know that they ever quite got around to killing a tiger, but they certainly killed a couple of rhinos and other things. Quite an incredible spectacle it would have been.
Well, all of a sudden you've got these devices, these weapons that really turn the tables. I guess the combat between a human and a tiger, and another one of these powerful animals.
Yeah.
These powerful wild animals.
Pretty hard to kill a tiger. Pretty hard to kill it with a bow and arrow and a spear, because they've got thick hides. And of course they're huge animals, and you have to get fairly close to them. So it was really when guns were invented that you really saw the royalty being able to kill a lot of tigers. And there's lots of stories of people, royalty throughout India, who would do things like they'd just sit in trees. They were very unsportsmanlike. They'd sit in trees and just wait for animals to come along during the roads, and just bang, and kill them. But tigers in particular were, because they were so hard to kill, it was really expected that the royalty would kill off these animals, because they had the capacity to hire all these people, hire all these specialists to train hunting elephants and others to go on these massive hunts and be able to kill particularly man-eating tigers. Man-eating tigers are considered... There's a special kind of terror associated with man-eating tigers, I think, particularly among maybe the serfs, that you see in feudal era Nepal and India. Because they were so hard to kill, they still have this kind of mysteriousness about them. There's still actually man-eating tigers out in Nepal, particularly around national parks. And there's quite a big issues with tigers coming out of national parks and maybe just taking children, taking people, particularly if they've been injured. So you tend to find with a lot of man-eating tigers, the reason why they're killing people is because they've injured their legs or they've got bad teeth, and so it's really hard for them to kill animals like rhinos and their normal prey, deer. Unlike leopards, who are just killers. They'll just kill anything and everything, and they have no problem with killing human beings, and they like the taste of them.
Let's focus a bit more on the massacre itself. In 2001, is that when it happened? It's something that came out of nowhere. And how much did you feel walking through those streets? How much of an effect did those events about 13 years ago now have on the present day?
When you go to the palace where this happened, the Nepalese have actually bulldozed the building in which it happened. All you can really see there are the foundations, and there's signs that say where various things happen. But the Nepalese themselves, within a couple of months of the events, the palace authorities have bulldozed this building. It was an event that I think was pretty cataclysmic, partly because Nepal was already in the middle of a civil war with, of all people, communists, with a Maoist insurgency. And then, of course, this event happened, and you saw a sense of terror, a sense of uncertainty that came out of that event. Probably the reason why there's a democracy in Nepal now, or at least a republic in Nepal, is because of those particular events. I think otherwise, you do hear stories about the royal family and people. There's a lot of distrust of the royal family still, because the royal family had a lot of power up to the 1990s. They had a lot of power in Nepal. They had set up a system in which they effectively, the king effectively controlled parliament. And then there were a whole bunch of protests in the 1990s, and the king gave up a lot of power and probably became a bit more popular as time went on, because people realised just how corrupt the government was. It's very corrupt over in Nepal, lots and lots of corruption in every facet of life. But
they're finding themselves, the people of Nepal are finding themselves in this situation where they can't trust their government. It's corrupt.
I suspect that if Dipendra hadn't have killed his father and hadn't have killed the other members of his family who he killed, the royal family would probably be quite a powerful force in Nepal even today. I think they probably would have clawed back a lot of power that they had. Maybe a bit like, in England, a very, very long time ago, you had kings fighting with Parliament for control of the executive branches of government. I think that's probably what we would still be seeing, but I think the act of a madman probably finished off their legitimacy.
A lot of the royal family's power would have just disappeared in those few minutes.
I think it did, and I think that then the events afterwards, as other royal family members tried to regain control and reclaim a status quo, they effectively tried to overthrow Parliament and overthrow the Constitution, which the Constitution hadn't really been written yet. The government was still trying to work its way through that, but I think that it led to such uncertainty that really there was no legitimacy left for the monarchy at all.
It was just this point of time, this point in history in which such a killings, like this very pivotal event, could really take shape, and it could really push forward into a different nation afterwards. Yeah,
very much so, very much. And I think the shockwaves of that murder, those murders, will probably be felt for hundreds of years. In the same way that the massacres that took place in the 1800s in Nepal actually still affected politics, even up until the 1960s and 70s in Nepal.
If there's anyone out there who's very interested in this piece of history that a lot of Westerners might not be very, very aware of, where can they go aside from your blog?
Well, there's a whole bunch of links on my blogs to various news articles. The Nepali Times, a couple of years ago on the 10th anniversary, did some really interesting stuff, a really interesting retrospective on the effect that murder had, and some really quite beautiful articles explaining, well, from their point of view, from the editor at the time, his thinking on stuff. It had just been a thunderstormy evening and everyone had knocked off, and suddenly they started getting these stories coming through, these mad stories that couldn't possibly have been true, that there had been gunfire at the palace, and that really sets up some really fascinating stuff. So I definitely would recommend going on the site and then trying to find the links that I've got there to the Nepali Times articles.
TomWrightStuff.wordpress.com, but for those who couldn't catch that, just thenewlocal.net, scroll down a bit on this very post, and I'll have a link right there. This is the first of many posts that you were looking at putting together.
Yeah, so a lot of them I'll look at. I spent a lot of time hiking around the Annapurna circuit.
Yep.
Which is up in the Himalayas. One of the more popular trekking areas, that and Everest Base Camp, they're the two areas that everybody knows about on the trekking circuit, the international trekking circuit. It's a beautiful place and so much history and so many interesting people too, who I'll be talking about in the coming months. As soon as I write these articles up.
Do you have any juicy previews, a juicy teaser of what to expect? Can we expect more action?
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about a guy called Maurice Herzog, who was a Frenchman who led the first successful ascent of Annapurna, Mount Annapurna.
Yep.
Well, the highest part of the Mount Annapurna Massif. So that's probably going to come up. He's a very interesting guy in himself. We'll also be talking about people like Michael Pacel, who travelled extensively throughout there and was a writer who did a lot of stuff, was really well known. He wrote a book on a guy called Boris Lisanovich, who was just the most fascinating guy, a Russian guy who had been a ballet dancer, and then he'd done all this other kind of interesting stuff and found his way into managing a hotel in Kathmandu, of all places. And so I think I'll be looking a bit at him, but also at some of the really interesting people, the guides who took me around this place, and also some of the people I went with, because I went with my mum and with my uncle and a couple of other people who were all really interested in hiking and are really fascinating people in themselves.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Thank you. It's been a pleasure having you on the other podcast.
Yeah, no, thank you.
At the time of recording this, the first episode of Local Chats just went up a couple of days ago, so I'm pretty excited to see that go up there and to see what feedback is happening. Now, this is either going to be I don't know if this is going to be the third or the fourth episode yet. So thank you. This has been Local Chats for another fortnight. Remember, you can go to www.thenewlocal.net. You'll find other episodes of this podcast. You can find Bendigo Decides, the other podcast that I do with Tom. We're talking about the state election, largely from Bendigo's perspective, but we talk a bit about Melbourne as well.
Yeah, we talk a bit about Melbourne. It's a bit quaint that most journalists who are based in Melbourne talk all about Melbourne when Bendigo is the centre of politics in this country. But we try hard just to distill it down to how it's going to be for Bendigo and what it might mean for people in Bendigo.
You do get that big difference of Bendigo's position between the state and the federal levels, because on the federal level, Bendigo is just one of many seats, whereas on the state, you could argue that Bendigo is one of the bigger seats to be we're a bigger fish in a smaller pond.
Yeah, that's right, and there's so much more that happens in Bendigo that's really vital for how this state is run.
We won't dive too much into that, because we've got a whole other podcast for that. But I might do a direct link to the Bendigo Decides feed just below this YouTube video on the post. So yeah, just go check that out, listen to the archives if you want, and yeah, that'll be good. Obviously, as always, you can find us on Twitter @thenewlocal, tomwritestuff.wordpress.com, or you can find Tom's Twitter @TomBendigo. Thank you for listening. It's been very interesting talking to you for the past 20 minutes. The one thing I love about this show is the variety. So far at this point, no two episodes are the same, and I love it. And yeah, we'll be back in 2 weeks. Who knows what we'll bring? Who knows?
I'm looking forward to it, Lewis.
Keep classy.